Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Choose Inclusion. This is a special kind of timely one because we're going to be talking about the Georgia voter suppression law or laws that went into effect or were voted in about a month or so ago. And so we're going to talk about that and the effect of that on the Black community and other communities of color. But first of all, hello to my amazing co-hosts Nina and Mike. How are you two?
I'm doing great. How are you two?
Hello, hello, hello. I'm so excited to be back and I'm super excited for our guest. I think it's going to be an incredibly dynamic conversation this afternoon.
Totally agree. And so without further ado, let's introduce Magalie René, CEO of Workplace Catalyst. And Magalie, I first of all, hello, welcome, and how are you doing?
Hello, I'm doing great today. I'm so excited to be here. This is actually a really, it's a momentous interview, oddly, because I attended my cousin and god sister's funeral this morning, and her name was Midwin Charles, and she was a legal analyst for MSNBC, CNN, and countless other media, and it's really an honor to be having this conversation in this way on this topic today of all days. So thank you so much for having me.
No, well, thank you for, honoring us with the time. Sorry about your loss, but yeah, thank you. And I agree. I think this conversation it's so powerful given everything that's going on right now. But first, tell us a little bit about you, kind of your background, your history. I think it's just fascinating.
Sure. Yeah. So my background is actually in communications, so marketing and public relations. I was working in communications for Fortune 500 companies. I've supported mom and pop shops, all kinds of businesses, organizations, companies for about 13 years before I transitioned and eventually went to work for the next 5 years, somewhere in between, for the Ford Foundation. And I was working in sustainable livelihoods. And that's really where I fell in love with social justice and social work, social change work. And eventually I landed where I am now, which is running my company, Workplace Catalyst, where we really support mission-driven companies in bridging compassionate leadership and belonging and well-being. We really believe that those three things, they live together and must be worked on together in order to really create sustainable change. So that's my background.
I love it. And so in your name, so we talked about your name, and it's French and Haitian history, but also, you mentioned that your first language was French, right? And
It was until I was 5, until kindergarten.
oh,
The name is French, is how I got it, because the national language of Haiti at the time was French, and I certainly spoke French only until 5. So English is actually my second language. I never kind of thought about it like that until now.
I'm the same. My Spanish was my first language, so probably the first 2 3 years, and then we moved from my dad's from Argentina, and we moved from South America to the U.S. And it's really, I'm so thankful now because it sort of gave me that structure, that foundation to where it's a little easier for me, even though I don't speak it frequently, to kind of get back into it, right, and pick it up and at least understand it better.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been to Paris and yeah, I've been to Paris and other countries, but Paris about 5 or 6 times. And on the fifth trip there, I believe it was the fifth trip, it could have been the fourth. All of a sudden, I could read everything. I could order off the menu. I could ask questions. I was able to get directions. Like the language just sort of comes back. It's like a muscle. It's like muscle memory.
Yeah, well, and I know, like, it takes me a couple days usually when I'm visiting, like Argentina. I'll start dreaming in Spanish, and
Oh, interesting.
it's really weird. It's so weird, and it doesn't stick for long, but that's when I know, like, okay, I still got it. Well, so let's talk about the Georgia voter suppression laws. I, I don't know what. Tell us what we should know.
I mean, what we should know is that we're calling it a voter suppression law. It's actually SB 202, and we're calling it that because ultimately that's the result. And there are a lot of very, very disturbing similarities to the Jim Crow laws And, the question that I like to ask, the critical questions that I like to ask when we see legislation like this is, to what end? Right? To what end would be one of the questions. And the next would be, who will be most impacted? Because those are really important questions to ask. And when you dig down deep, there are 16 provisions that ultimately hamper the right to vote for some Georgians and or strip power from state and local elections officials, right, elected officials, and gives it to the legislators. So it's really ultimately a power grab. So when we talk about to what end, it's so that a particular party can make a power grab because they have the power to do so, because the legislators, it's run by Republicans at the moment in Georgia and in other states, because this kind of law is popping up in other states as well. And that's to what end? That's why this is happening, is because they know they cannot win elections when Black people, large numbers of Black people of color, go out and they vote, right? So it's truly, and who will be impacted most? It is people of color ultimately, because the neighborhoods that have the lowest number of polling locations are neighborhoods of color, low income neighborhoods. And I can get into more specifics. I'll give you just a few. One would be that instead of 24-hour access outdoors to drop boxes, the limited number, and the numbers have been limited, will be placed indoors inside government buildings and early voting sites, and thus they become unavailable to voters who want to drop their ballots off in the evenings or non-business hours. So when you think about it, who will that impact most? It impacts workers, people that are doing 9 to 5 work, or maybe they're working overtime, and they're the people that are working hard and doing the kinds of jobs that they can't take off from, usually are people of color. So that's just one of the many things, waiting in long lines. Who's waiting in long lines? The people in the neighborhoods that have the fewest number of polling locations. And those locations were lowered in number by the Shelby decision. Look that up, the Shelby decision in 2013. And so that's who's waiting in these long lines. And now this act has made it a misdemeanor crime to give someone food or water in a line. So what does that tell you? The point of this is to discourage people from voting, right? We had Stacey Abrams register 800,000 voters, many of them of color, in Georgia. And so those voters are most affected by this. And that's what really the Republicans are fighting back on. And I don't even like to talk about party lines, because ultimately I'm a moderate. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, that's what this particular government that's in power in Georgia at the moment is doing. And they happen to be Republican. So I'm just sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a pretty personal topic for me. Some of our listeners don't know this, but I used to do political work, and I actually worked on the 2004 presidential election, doing get out the vote work with largely in Black communities, African American communities, Haitian communities, and Latinx communities down in South Florida. And one of the things that we would do was, it was so clear the difference between access to voting polls for rich white neighborhoods versus Black and brown neighborhoods, because you could go vote in North Miami Beach, where it's predominantly white, and you would never have to wait in line. But if you lived somewhere in Dade County, you would literally be waiting in line for 4 or 5 hours. And I used to hand out water and food to folks who were waiting in line, because the polls would close at 7, and they literally wouldn't get to vote until 10 or 11 p.m. at night, because they were allowed to vote, but only because they happened to get there before 7, happened to get in the line before 7 p.m.
And it's intentional.
Oh, yeah.
It's clear this is very intentional. These long lines in these specific neighborhoods to dissuade these specific voters from casting their vote. It is 100% intentional.
It absolutely is. But I think one of the things that's interesting, there's been a huge history of voter suppression laws. That's Exactly. And it's been intentional. It's been around for hundreds of years. To me, this is just yet another one. But what surprised me was that all these companies came out in early April, like Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines and Google and Salesforce and Patagonia and American Express, and all these private Fortune 500 companies are coming out and they're like saying, hey, we don't support this bill. And
Yep. Yep.
you never, I mean, honestly, I having worked in politics, there's not often times where you see like big companies coming out and supporting a thing like this when it doesn't have a direct, well, honestly, it doesn't seem to have a direct impact on their bottom line. That their lobbyists aren't going to be going out and putting their money and resources to, but then this all of a sudden changed. What happened? Why did that change this time around?
So I have an interesting perspective on this. So first of all, I think we've got to kind of back out of the conversation, the specifics of the conversation for just a moment to give context. And I think this is a conversation about leadership. And in particular, it's a conversation about compassionate leadership. So when you begin to look at what is happening in the world, the more polarized we get, it makes me think of, and I'm not making an analogy here, but I just think it's a really interesting way to look at things. If you think about Germany pre-war World War II, and you think about like it was polarized, right? At some point there was a buildup, and the country was getting more and more and more polarized. And somehow in the midst of that, I'm going to bring us back to now, where we are now, we've got like very opposing energies. And ultimately, what's the direction we're heading in? As you get further and further away from each other, as people get further and further away from each other, right? The only place that we're going to go if we continue to go in that direction is war. Like that's the ultimate bad, right? That can happen. And so when you're in that kind of context, and then you add, so you got polarization, you add a racial awakening, you add the graphic, gruesome murder of George Floyd, right? It's the catalyst for all of this. You add in a pandemic, a global pandemic. You add in the increase of mental health problems. I mean, I could go on and on and on if I want to talk about the challenges that we're faced with in this moment in time. So when we begin to look at leadership, in order to be effective at leadership, you've got to be a compassionate leader. I think it all of a sudden behooves companies and organizations and executives. They are faced with, it's sort of a come to, for lack of a better term, and it's not because it's religious, but I just like the term, the come to Jesus moment, right? A come to Buddha moment, where you just decide at some point, what kind of leader will I be? What kind of organization? What do we want to support? We're either on the side of humanity and democracy, or we are not, right? You get to that point where it begins to become black and white. And what's gotten us here, the kind of leadership that's gotten us this far, will not support us as a human race in navigating this moment in time, and it won't get us where we want to go, assuming that where we want to go is humanity, right? Equality, unity, diversity, equity, inclusion. If that's where we're headed, then the leadership that's gotten us this far won't get us there. So I think companies are having it's like an existential crisis, right? And in this come to Buddha moment where they recognize we either are on the side of democracy or we're not. And it's really these voter suppression laws and shifts and these changes they're anti-democratic, they're anti-American. And so I think that's what it comes down to. And compassionate leadership, when people talk about that or hear those terms, I know that sometimes they're thinking, okay, we need to be enablers, we're going to hold hands and sing kumbaya. But being a compassionate leader isn't about that. It's actually about standing up with courage, leading with conviction. And I think companies like Delta, Coca-Cola's CEO, Major League Baseball, which I don't know if you mentioned, Will Smith, Anton Fuqua as directors, doing these big budget movies, they're really deciding to take a stand. And it's a very clear-cut decision to be compassionate leaders and have the courage and conviction to take a stand against something that's anti-American and anti-democratic.
What's interesting about that there's a contrast too, I think. And by the way, so Nina and I, we have taught some bias and empathy courses, and we talk a lot about compassionate empathy being a level of empathy that we should all strive for, especially as leaders. Exactly to your point, because it's very hard to achieve. So it's not an easy thing to do. But it really is the best place that leaders can be at to really truly be able to help those around them. And so I love that focus. There's a contrast though when talking about these companies and these film productions, because so Ryan Coogler, who's the director of Black Panther and the upcoming Black Panther 2, has stated that they're keeping their production in Georgia to support the people of, who rely on a production of that size for income, right? What's that? That to me, it's a very, so there's an interesting dynamic here at play.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think it's a really great point of conversation. So yeah, I'm assuming you're asking for my thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would love it. Yeah, sorry. Yes, please.
I didn't want to cut off your point
No,
if you said what to make. Okay. Yeah, I think this is really interesting. So I want to just make it clear that if we circle back, right, in terms of compassionate leadership, one of the foremost tenets of being a compassionate leader is awareness. That's like one of the first things I have, because I do similar work to you, and one of the first things that I have executives that we're leading through these programs think about is awareness. So again, it brings us right back to the first two questions: to what end? And who will be most impacted? Another way to think about that is, what is my intention and who will be most impacted? So I can't speak specifically to Ryan Coogler's decision, but based on what you're sharing, he thought about those two questions and decided that to what end, what is his intention? Perhaps his intention with that production is to support the people of color, perhaps the most marginalized groups, right? They are the most marginalized groups, people who can use the income most. And he decided that perhaps that outweighed his desire to boycott, right? And so you've got to weigh it. As a compassionate leader, maybe that was the most effective decision for him to make. Who will be most impacted? Perhaps he asked himself. And mind you, this is all speculation. I don't know for sure. I'd have to read up more about it. And really, I want anyone who's listening, don't hold me to this, but I'm just kind of taking a guess and giving my own opinion based on the little information that I have. So perhaps he was thinking, who will be most impacted? The people that will be most directly impacted by my decision to leave and take this production elsewhere are the people who need the support of a production like this the most. So I think it's important, as we're thinking about, again, bigger picture, right? As we're thinking about these big picture moments in time, these moments that have us really look at our lives and our decisions as leaders. And we've got decisions to make. And we're thinking about things like racial equity, like diversity, like inclusion. We're thinking about how can we be most compassionate, support the most people. You've got to really be specific. The way that you respond to something may not look like the way the leader at another organization or in another role or another department. It may not look the same, but it may be as effective when you look at your specific situation. So I don't think we should paint anyone with the same color brush. The same goes for people of color. We're not a monolith, right? So we've got to really be specific about our intention. To what end are we making the decisions that we choose to make? And who will be most impacted and how will they be impacted? So that's what I got there, but it's definitely an interesting conversation.
Well, and I think, Magalie, when you think of, again, kind of post George Floyd murder, which we're coming up on the year anniversary of, and we're literally hours after the conviction right now, this point in time. What's interesting about kind of how all these subjects in my mind kind of connect is you had for the first time massive brands committing massive amounts of money towards the Black Lives Matter movement, and again it was easy to be cynical. These organizations, oh, it's so easy to throw out money, Google's obviously got 120 million they can spend. Apple's obviously got $100 million they can spend. But when you look at like the monies for Apple, when they were super super specific and talking about how they want the money to go out to HBCUs and all that sort of thing, and now you again on this timeline, this continuum that we're on, and then these laws come through, like you're starting to see like the compassionate leaders from these brands and how they're spending their money and what they're standing up for and what they're not. Like this isn't a one-off, and that's to me really really important. I think for us to realize is that and these are these are significant, like they to say that Google are Googlers, and people who are all Google, they're all Google, and people who are Applers, they're all Apple, and like they have influence on our culture and our purchasing power. So I really, for me, and yes, whether or not they're doing Black Panther 2, keeping there, the economic conversation is just really an important conversation for us to keep in mind, because it these brands are leveraging their monies for this influence, and it's continuing.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. I think it's important. It's great to see. There's I tend to think of myself as an optimist, and I'm just gonna adjust the pronunciation of my name there because I know people are listening. It's Magalie for anyone who is confused. It gets pronounced so many different ways, which I'm totally I'm fine with. But it's Magalie is the pronunciation. And I wanted to say that I think it's really important and powerful that different companies are getting to that point where they're finally realizing it can't be a one-off, right? It can't be a one-off. And there's a question that gets to be answered also for these brands is our brand message, is it matching our brand's advocacy? So ultimately, if you are incongruent as a brand, and if it's inauthentic, meaning it's a one and done, that's something that people are paying attention to, and they influence our buying power. But also conversely, our buying power influences these brands. So I do think I agree with you. It is 100% it's also a business decision, certainly.
So Magalie, where do you think we're going? Like given the changes that we've seen just over the last year, what do you think is going to be the change we're going to see moving forward?
Let's see. I mean, I honestly can't answer that because I can't see the future, and I don't think any of us can answer that because I don't think any of us know. Right? I think the question we get to be asking ourselves is, what kind of future do we wish to see? And not only that, that's the first question, but the next is, what am I committed to? One of the things I often am facilitating around, or my facilitators are supporting organizations in coming to clarity on, and leadership in coming to clarity on, is what am I committed to, right? Because transformation and change and diversity, equity, inclusion, it's on a continuum. And so knowing that it can't be a one and done, to Mike's point, knowing that it is going to affect business, knowing that your brand advocacy gets to match your brand's values, and gets to be aligned. I think it's really ultimately about, what are you committed to? Because the action that you're going to take today may not be the action that's called for tomorrow based on what's happening, right? None of us can predict the future, and we don't know how much worse things are going to get. We don't know how much better, but we can certainly commit to set our intention, and then commit our actions to it. And that's the best I have in terms of reading the future, Nina.
Now that's great, and I think that's for our audience. I love the practicality of asking the right questions, being more curious, but asking the right questions to figure out what you want that future to be, but also to figure out what the intention is behind the things that you're doing. I think that's a huge takeaway, because very often it is very performative, the things that are done, and they're for press releases or whatever, social media posts. But did anybody think about, like, what could we actually do? What's the impact we could actually make, and what is the future that we could shape? instead of just sort of sitting back and applauding when we think we need to applaud, or supporting when we think we need to support, without really thinking about why we're doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's what's showing up is when we have legislation like SB 202, right? And these voter suppression laws that are coming to the forefront. I think it's people. This isn't just about business. It's also there are people who run the businesses, right? And I think people are beginning to realize that they've got to put their money where their mouth is. They've got to put their time and attention where they say in the press releases they're going to do it, and they're being held accountable to it. So that's a
Well,
great thing to see too.
absolutely. Well, and especially from a talent perspective, which is the world that the three of us live in a lot, the talent are demanding it. They don't want to go work for a company who supports that a voter suppression law. They don't want to go and work for a company that doesn't believe in helping the community around them, or being diverse, being inclusive. So companies who fail to see and understand and believe that are going to go away, because they're not going to have anybody
Yeah.
to work for them.
Yeah. I think they're going to go. I definitely agree. And we also just saw. Oh, now I'm thinking of his name, but I'll tell you in 1 second if I can think about the name. But he just got let go. Uh, I'm looking for it. I can't think of, I don't have his name, but this is an 88-year-old man who's been running, he's been in a position of leadership. He was the president of a particular organization 8 times in 8 consecutive years. I mean, or 8 times in a row rather. And
Right.
he just got fired. He just got fired. I'm going to find it in a second and tell you
Well,
all.
so yeah,
Philip Burke. It was
while you
Philip
do
Burke.
that, who was it?
I found it. Philip Burke.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And really, this is huge. He was a longtime member of the it's an acronym, so it's tough, but it's HFPA. And he just got fired at 88 years old because he sent an email and it was deemed racist. And we just, leaders really, again, what's gotten us this far won't get us where we're going.
Well, and I just firmly believe like there's these movements, and for all of the all of the harm that can be done with social media, that sort of thing. I truly believe the fact of the matter is there can be something that we can do and continue to share this kind of positive type messaging that's out there, and support the organizations that are against this. And then quite honestly, the organizations that are in Atlanta that feel like they have a congressman in their back pocket or whatever, like at some point in time there's only so many conservative white dudes to go around, and truly they are going to run out of talent.
That's Mike, that was such a Mike. Oh my gosh, Mike, that was a mic drop.
Yes,
Nice.
that was it. Oh, I love it. No, yeah, exactly. No, I mean that's exactly it. And yeah, that's why this conversation just needs to keep happening. And Magalie, we can't thank you enough for bringing this because it is such a pertinent right now conversation, for bringing your perspective and bringing some clarity to it. And yeah, just really, I think giving people a way to combat things like this, or at least a way to think about combating it in an effective way. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It was really an honor, and I'm just couldn't have been the better way to end my day. My cousin Midwin Charles would have been very, very proud. She was a big advocate, social justice advocate in her legal analysis, and I am very honored to be discussing this particular topic. And there are things that regular people can do. We can write to our elected officials. We can protest. We get to raise our voices and do all that we can to make sure that this type of law, these types of laws, really don't go unanswered.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining us today, especially on such a um, important day for you with your grieving process. So thank you for sharing this moment with us. We really appreciate it. And sorry I massacred the
You're
pronunciation of your
forgiven. You're forgiven.
name. And thank you all listeners for joining us once again. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was great to be here.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.